Wonderful. I think I'm going to kick things off now. So I just want to say hello, everyone, and welcome to our July 2024 charity catch-up event. Whether you're here for the first time or as a regular, you are very welcome. My name is Josh Kingston. I'm one of the partners of Burton Suite, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ed Marsh, our Senior Charity Advisor, and Cecile Gillard, our Charity Legal Manager, to speak to you this afternoon. The plan for our event today is that we have two key topics that we will be covering over the next 45 minutes or so. Then we're going to have an update for you of sort of charity sector news, and together that will bring us to around 1 p.m. From 1, you're invited to stay with us for an opportunity to ask questions. But if you do need to slip away, please do feel free to do so. In regard to questions, please do use the chat at any point during the event to ask questions or comment on the content. We sometimes have a really good sort of back and forth between yourselves and ourselves, which we love. We'll pick up on any questions at the end of our session in that question and answer section. But just again, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a sort of chat function there. We'll invite you as we go along to ask questions there. Captions are enabled on this event, so if you need them, you can turn those on by selecting that option again below at the bottom of your screen on the menu bar. These are automatically generated, though hopefully, so it might get them wrong, but hopefully it will still be helpful for those who would like to use them. Please do note that this event is recorded, but however, no delegate faces or names will be on the recording. Later this afternoon, we will send out an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides. We'd also be grateful if you could reply to that email with any feedback that you may have about the event, the speakers, or any topics that you would like to hear from us in the future. We've sometimes had some really good responses there that have triggered topics for presentation in future events. So please do that. Before we kick off, I'm just going to mention an event that we've got coming up later in the year, which is our Trustees Week event. Following last year's successful event, we are planning to run it back in 2024. It's a free event where we celebrate the great work of our trustees, and we do it with some food and drink, a chance to talk to others in the sector, and we have a short address too, which last year particularly went down very well. The date to keep in mind for your diaries, as it is on the screen, is Wednesday, the 6th of November, starting from 5 o'clock. So please do save the date in your diary. Keep your eyes open for our invitation, which we will be sending out soon so that you can reserve your place. Do note that it's not an exclusive event. So you're more than welcome to pass the invitation on to other trustees you might know. Often potential trustees who are thinking about trusteeship, it's a good event to sort of bring them in to as well, or anybody else that you might know in the sector. Wonderful. I will now hand over to Cecile, who's going to kick us off on the subject of the heart of your charity, your charitable purpose. Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you, Josh, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So yes, let's look at the very heart of your charity, which is indeed its charitable purpose. So the first legal point in particular I want you to focus on is that you are only a charity because you have charitable purposes. That is an absolute legal condition for an organisation being a charity. The terminology can confuse a little sometimes, and we'll talk a good bit about words and wording and their meanings in this session. In the old legal language, and this is what you may find in your governing document, your charity's constitution, the old legal language, once upon a time, the charitable purposes were called objects. Be careful not to confuse that with objectives, as in strategic objectives. So Object may be the term you find in old material, including an old constitution, to describe what the modern law calls charitable purposes. I'm going to use charitable purposes. That's what the modern law uses, and I think it's a more helpful way of looking at things. Purpose, think about the meaning of the plain English word. There is something very fundamental about purpose, and indeed, that is the point in terms of a charity's purpose. It is the fundamental reason why the organisation exists. It is the answer to that great "why are we here" question. And everybody in a charity should be able to give a ready answer to the "why are we here" question. Ultimately, everything a charity does should be because doing those things are championing its charitable purposes. The law also says that the purposes must be exclusively charitable. There can be no non-charitable element of purpose within the purposes of the organisation. If there was, it would simply not be a charity, and it would never have been given the legal status of being a charity. And the law also says that these exclusively charitable purposes must be for the public benefit. And that means for the public benefit within the legal principles of charitable public benefit. It does not mean that a charity can do anything it likes because it has some positive impact on the public. Many, many things have positive impacts on the public, but that many of those things are not charitable activities. So your impact must be of a charitable nature, and your impact must be relevant to your charitable purposes. The public benefit given has to directly relate to the charitable purposes. Now, there's an important point here around public fora, public thinking, public concentration, and public points of concern. A charity cannot choose or change what it does just because there is public interest in something, public concern about something, or public debate about something. There might be a thing that really matters to people in general, or to some people in particular. They might be interested in it, really concerned about it. But as a charity, you are not to engage with that if it's outside your purposes. And you should always be concentrating your efforts on the things that do directly further those purposes and that provide appropriate charitable outcomes to those purposes. Now, those core principles around charitable purposes and public benefit of those purposes, those are critically true in all scenarios, those principles, whether we are talking about contested heritage, whether we are talking about climate change or anything else. You've got to remember those principles apply to your charity. And it's because the charity is legally bound by its purposes that it must focus on direct pursuit of them and always operate within them. Now, that has fundamental implications on every aspect of the governance of the charity, the management, and the operation. For example, if you're fundraising, it must be for something within your purposes. When you're deciding what to spend funds on and how to use the other resources of the charity, from premises to people, paid or volunteer, you've got to have justifiable reasons demonstrating how this action will pursue your purposes to deliver appropriate planned charitable outcomes. So, for example, if a charity has purposes to relieve suffering amongst those who abuse alcohol, its board can't justify entering into a resource sharing agreement with a charity that has purposes to deal with drug abuse issues. My first charity would be devoting its resources outside its charitable purposes. That would be unlawful, it would be inappropriate, it would be a breach of trustees' duties, indeed a breach of trust. So charitable purposes, let's move on to look a little more at them. The Charities Act sets out 13 descriptions of potentially charitable purposes. And it is only if an organisation's purposes fall within one of those descriptions and the purposes are for the public benefit and the organisation is established under the law of England and Wales that it will be a charity. You've got to have all three ducks lined up to be a charity as a matter of law. Now, the descriptions, 13 of them in the Act, include areas where many charities exist with purposes that fall within that particular area: the advancement of religion, the advancement of education, the prevention or relief of poverty. But there are also some where only a really tiny proportion of charities that exist have their purposes. An example of that would be promoting the efficiency of the armed forces or the emergency services. Only a tiny number of charities that would fall within that description. I'm going to urge you to read your purposes carefully, and I'm going to do that more than once today. Careful reading of your purposes should identify that they clearly fall within one of those descriptions. Elsewise, you would not be a charity. And it's essential you know and you understand what your purposes are. Where do you look for them? Because you're not going to be able to read them, understand them, and then work in accordance with them unless you know where to find them. Well, for the vast majority of you, the purposes will be set out in your main governing document, in your constitution. There are some exceptions to that, but for most of you, that's the place to go and look. And all the trustees and the entire senior leadership team, if you're fortunate enough to have some paid staff, need to be sure they're familiar with the purposes, they understand them, and they get the effect and meaning of the wording of the purposes. We're always ready to help and advise on that, and it's something where we'd encourage you to come and have conversations. So, another example, wording really matters. Charity A's purposes are to relieve suffering amongst those who are poor and of advanced age through the provision of almshouses. Now, changing social conditions mean many more young and middle-aged people have housing needs, maybe because of disability, family breakup, shortage of affordable accommodation. But Charity A can't build new accommodation for students. Charity A can't let units in its existing almshouses to families. Move on, if we could, with the visuals, please. Identifying what your core purpose is important to getting this understanding right, because that's where you must concentrate. Fundamentally, what is this charity actually about? And there should be beneficial results of the charitable activities that are undertaken to further that purpose. Charitable outcomes from pursuing the purpose. But the outcomes, remember, are not themselves the purposes. So another distinction to draw there. What's the purpose? And as we are doing things to pursue it, what should the impact, what should the outcome be? So, Charity B, the purposes read, to reduce offending and risk of offending by educating those at risk of offending and those convicted of offences. The purpose is the advancement of education. The outcome should be less people offending or re-offending. Some of the benefit that flows from the pursuit of the purpose will be crime reduction. So society as a whole benefits, as well as the offenders and their families benefiting. And distinguish the purpose from the activities that are done to pursue the purpose. The activities are the how your charity pursues its purposes. So, Charity C, purposes to protect the wildlife and natural environment of location X in the county of Dorset by holding and managing the site as a nature reserve. The purpose is the advancement and protection of the environment of that particular location and the wildlife living there. The method by which that is to be done is by operating this nature reserve. The activities mix the charity does on that site will be chosen to protect the site and its wildlife. Charity C can't acquire other nature reserves. Charity C can't campaign about plastic pollution in the world's oceans. Its purpose is more limited than those two examples. If there are multiple purposes, you have a job to do in distinguishing whether there is a main purpose. Now, there are some charities with multiple purposes where the purposes have equal weight, and the charity may very well be carrying out activities to pursue all of the purposes. Really, the most classic example of that is a traditional grant-making charity. The way in which it works is by funding charitable activity undertaken by other charities. And if it has several purposes that it can further by its grant making, then those purposes may have equal weight, maybe as it were a genuinely multi-purpose charity. But most charities that have more than one purpose, actually, when you look at the purposes properly and you understand the context of that charity, have one main purpose. Charity D, purposes to advance the Christian religion, advance education, and relieve poverty. But when we look at Charity D properly, we find that both its origins, its founders' intentions, the reason why people have and still do give donations to it is the principal purpose of advancing the Christian religion. That's where all of the evidence in Charity D quite rightly points. So a core purpose here does exist, and it is advancing the Christian religion. So the activities Charity D chooses to do to educate people are activities around educating them about the beliefs and practices of Christianity, not wider education, because the core purpose of our charity here is to advance the Christian religion. Purposes also will help you work out whether you have discretion about who you help and or how you help them. Charity E, its purposes are to relieve suffering caused by homelessness in England and Wales. So the trustees have discretion on how to give the relief. An emergency night shelter, perhaps, support for people as they transition from street homelessness to permanent accommodation. And there's an element of discretion around where the help is given. But if you listened carefully, I said relieving suffering caused by homelessness in England and Wales. Now, Charity E, its heritage is that it was actually founded by, and it's widely supported by, including with funding, people who are of Caribbean heritage. They are understandably terribly upset by the losses caused by Hurricane Beryl, which has just happened in the Caribbean, and they're very anxious that many people living in that part of the world are now homeless. But its trustees cannot possibly send funds to the relief effort in the Caribbean because its purposes are for relieving homelessness in England and Wales. For faith-based charities, you need to be really careful to identify whether you have faith purposes or your motivation comes from a faith, from a religious belief. It's often an area of confusion we find in religious charities that are faith-based. Are they really purposes about sharing the teachings and the practices of a religious faith and inviting others to be part of that faith? If they are, in legal terms, that's a charity for the advancement of a particular religion. And I gave an anonymized example a few minutes ago where the principal purpose was indeed the advancement of a particular stated religion. Or are you a faith-motivated charity which actually has different purposes, say anti-poverty purposes? The founders and the funders and the supporters and volunteers might be prompted to give the help they do to that charity because of their beliefs, but it's not a charity with purposes to advance the Christian faith or the Buddhist faith or whatever faith it may be. It's the motivation that drives people to want to relieve the poverty. So distinguish faith purposes from faith motivation. Where do your purposes fall? And our trustees have duties, thank you, Ed, around our charitable purposes. Remember, there are 6 general legal duties of charity trustees, and 3 of them, which I've highlighted here on the visual, have very particular importance in relation to responsibilities around purposes, ensuring the charity pursues its purposes and operates within them, complying with the governing document and the law. It is a legal requirement that you follow the purposes in your governing document, and to act in what the trustees honestly believe to be the best interests of the charity. That means the best interests of pursuing its purposes. In addition to specific statutory duties I wanted to highlight for our trustees, they must have regard to the Charity Commission's statutory public benefit guidance, which it issues in 3 volumes. One for public benefit in general, one for public benefit while you're operating the charity, and one for public benefit in your reporting. And that points to the fact that our trustees also have a specific duty to report on the principal activities the charity is doing to provide public benefit in pursuit of its charitable purposes. So, public benefit, thank you, Ed. Because you must have purposes that are for the public benefit, this concept is absolutely vital to doing the right thing to put your purposes at the heart of your charity. Your trustees have a shared and an individual responsibility for getting things right here. And there's 2 dimensions. The public. In relation to the public, every charity provides some general public benefit to the whole community simply because it exists with charitable purposes, carries out charitable activities, and those have a charitable impact. But critically, you need to read those purposes to identify who's the beneficiary group for your charity. Is it the public in general? Charity example: purposes to advance health through enhancing and protecting the quality of water supplies. We all need water, we all have to drink water, we all benefit from the quality of water being enhanced. Or is the wording such that we actually should be benefiting a particular section of the public? We need to read carefully to work out which of the 2 applies. Does the wording specifically say who benefits, or does it imply it? Does it also specifically say who must benefit, or who can? There's a difference between must and can. Or again, does it imply it? Is there a particular beneficiary need that must exist? People who are blind or have sight loss and impairment, people at risk of self-harm, people in poverty. Do these people have to have certain characteristics or be in particular circumstances? People aged 16 or under, people living in place X, or people suffering because of bereavement. So think about the wording in the beneficiaries and the beneficiary group. Is there a choice? What choice do you have? What discretion? Where do the boundaries lie? And what about the benefit? The benefit, the law says, must be appropriate to the purpose. So therefore, of course, it must be appropriate to the beneficiaries too. Generally, the benefit must be direct and able to be demonstrated by evidence. So an educational charity needs to plan and demonstrate positive educational outcome for those attending its educational events. It's not enough just to put on a range of events with a vague hope there'll be successful learning outcomes. The benefit must be of a charitable nature. So private benefits to individuals or organisations, including commercial ones, must never be the charity's focus, and private benefits must be purely incidental. So deciding what benefits to provide, the how we do what we do to achieve charitable outcome, trustees need to think about, again, the wording: to relieve sickness by providing hospice facilities, to advance education by providing learning materials. In some cases, the wording gives trustees discretion, in others it will be much less so. So, for example, to relieve suffering amongst those who have life-limiting and terminal illnesses by such means as the trustees decide. That charity has very significant trustee flexibility about how to help the life-limited people, whereas an example I gave a few minutes ago, there was a requirement to have a hospice. The discretion, where it exists, must be exercised reasonably and rationally, taking account of the fundamental purpose, which in that example is relieving suffering. So trustees needing to weigh up the likely impact and outcomes of the activities to decide what mix is best. Is it balancing daycare and home support against providing or funding hospice residential care? Thank you. Next visual, Ed. So your charity needs to put its charitable purposes at the heart of the organisation, because that's why you exist. Pursuing and staying true to those purposes is your most important task, and it's one of your biggest challenges. Delivering on the purposes effectively is the greatest thing you can do for your charity, and above all for the people that it exists to help. But you'll only be able to do that if you know the purposes, you understand the purposes, you focus on them, you pursue them in a dedicated, single-minded way, and then you deliver appropriate charitable outcomes as a result. Make that distinction also between your values and your purposes. The charity's values are around the guide stars of behaviour in their pursuit of purposes, around aspects of how we behave as we do what we do. And of course, those values should be consistent with the purposes, but they're not the purposes. Be clear about which of your activities enable the charity to operate and support its charitable mission, raising funds, running the staff payroll, maintaining the administrative headquarters, and those kind of necessary functions, distinguishing those from the direct charitable activity, providing the nursing and the medical care to the hospice patients, operating the lifeboats, running the food bank. Know where the boundaries are and stay within them. Charity 1. Purposes to relieve poverty by operating food banks in Somerset. It cannot open up new food bank locations in Bristol and Gloucestershire. Charity 2. Purposes to advance people's education in the performing arts through theatrical performances in the charity's theatre space. There's a popular and well-supported weekly community litter pick nearby the theatre, and it's going to close because its volunteer organisers have retired. But the performing arts charity can't take over the litter pick, because that's not educating the public about the performing arts. And charity 3. Purposes to educate people about the protection of the environment by operating nature reserves. It's not appropriate for the trustees to be considering acquiring and developing a community garden for general recreation, mental well-being, and the production of low-cost healthy food. All of this points to the fact that you've got to get your strategic direction of travel right for your purposes, and it's only if you're focused on the purposes you're going to make good strategic decisions. You're also only going to make wise use of the charity's financial and other resources on activities that directly further the purposes and provide the right charitable outcomes if you've got a grasp of the purposes and the implications of those purposes that I've been running around in the last few minutes. So actions. Thank you, Ed. Please come and get advice from us about your purposes and how you keep them at the heart of the organisation. We often find, and this is a great sadness to us, that difficulties, disappointments, and sometimes, I'm afraid, significant problems have arisen with projects, activities, spending decisions, fundraising, relationships even in a charity, and much of that could have been avoided if the trustees had at the outset thought it through with some help, with some support, with some guidance. They wouldn't have ended up in the wrong direction. Everybody should go away from today and revisit their purposes. Remind yourself what they say and what that means. Spot differences. Are there contradictions or discrepancies in what you say to the world about your purposes in your communications, on your website, even in your annual trustees report? Have you drifted away from them? have you made a mistake and taken a conscious decision to do something that's outside them and at odds with them? Also, review your strategy, your focus, your priorities. Make sure your resources are reorientated directly to your purposes for the charitable benefit of the people you're primarily there to help. You might need to adjust that mix of activities to concentrate on those that'll bring the best possible outcomes for your charity, whatever that purpose is: public education, poverty relief, homelessness reduction. Don't stray onto territory that's not yours to do. And if you've got any concerns, come and have that chat. Certainly everybody should be rereading the Charity Commission guidance volumes. I pointed them out here. We'll include them as a link when we send the post-event mailing. Excuse me. And could we change our purposes? Well, yes, but only within certain limitations. It's possible sometimes to do so if there are legal grounds. So your first thought should not be, oh, we can't do this, therefore the answer is change our purposes. Your first thought should be, is there any proper reason to change our purposes? And the answer to that may very well be no. But in some cases, the answer will be yes. The legal parameters will apply. If there's a convincing legal case for making change, that case has to be made to the Charity Commission. And it's only if the Charity Commission is convinced of the legal case and says yes to the change that the change can then happen. And a couple of core principles around change from charity law. You might be able to change, it might be justified if the purposes can't be pursued effectively any longer. Charity A, purposes to relieve poverty within parish X, but parish X has been got rid of, amalgamated into a new larger parish in church reorganisation. Could be that the Charity Commission would be able to accept a case for change to address poverty in the new larger parish with safeguards to make sure the existing funds are principally used in the original geographic area. Charity B, founded in 1950, another area where the legal principles might allow change, where there's been significant shift in social conditions, and that impacts adversely on the pursuit of the purposes. So Charity B was founded in 1950. It's got purposes to advance education of visually impaired school children by providing large print and braille books. Now, specialist teachers in schools now, of course, can work with those, but they can also work with a variety of other tools that help children with sight loss, like adaptive technology and digital learning materials. But our charity isn't able to fund any of that to go with the braille books and the large print books. So there could be a really good case to make that there should be permission given to alter the wording so that we can now offer flexed mixable options for the best help of the children in the schools. Flexibility, mixed options, maybe what we do need is to stick to the goal. Let us sincerely hope England can do that on Sunday night. Ed, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cecile. If we've not met before, my name's Ed. I'm going to spend a few minutes thinking about the Gift Aid on Small donation scheme, and I'm going to start with a bit of a surprise, and it might be an even bigger surprise than England making their way through to the final of the Euro 2024 Championship, and that is this, that HMRC have got this a bit wrong. This title is not really very correct at all, because it's not really gift aid at all as we think about the Gift Aid on Small donation scheme, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But first of all, we're going to start with a poll. I'd like to hear from you through this poll. And so I'm going to activate this poll in a second. I'm going to ask you, what does your charity claim? If you're kind of here representing a charity or got a charity in mind, does your charity claim gift aid? Does your charity claim both gift aid and gift aid on small donations? Does it claim neither of those? Or are you just kind of a bit puzzled? You haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. So I'm going to launch that poll now, and I would love to hear from you. Wonderful. We've got some results coming in. Keep going. Lovely. We'll just wait a few more seconds. What do you think? Gift aid only for your charity? Do you claim both gift aid and gift aid on small donations? Do you claim neither? Or do you not really quite know what this is all about? Okay, so I'm going to end that poll. I'm going to show the results. So we can see that 30% of you claim only gift aid, that 43% of you is not only gift aid, but gift aid on small donations. Just under a quarter say that you claim neither of those for whatever reason. That might be, of course, because you don't actually receive donations or receive donations eligible for gift aid. And so yeah, thank you for that. That's really insightful. We're going to have a little look at what this is all about. In fact, what I'm going to do is just remind you about gift aid. So if your charity claims gift aid, there are these core ingredients that you have to have in place. You need to be a charity with charity tax status. That is something that is awarded to you based on your status and an application process to ensure that you have fit and proper persons in place and that you're capable of being a charity that claims gift aid. For gift aid to apply, there needs to be a donation. It needs to be a freely given donation that is eligible. It needs to be a money payment. It can't be something in lieu or an asset or other item that's given to the charity that gift aid is claimed on. It must be a money payment. There must be a donation that's given within benefit limits. In other words, if there is a benefit in consequence of making the donation, then that needs to be below certain thresholds to be eligible for gift aid. There needs to be a clear audit trail. But this one at the bottom, a donor declaration, is a key ingredient. There is a need when you claim gift aid to have a trail between the donor that has made the donation and that donation. And so a declaration is needed. There needs to be a declaration that is kept up to date, and it includes these ingredients. And there's lots of different elements to a gift aid declaration, which you might know. But particularly there is an explanation on this declaration that puts the onus on the person making donation that they must have paid enough tax to be able to cover the gift aid that is reclaimable on the donations they have made, and it's their responsibility to make sure that that is the case. That's because gift aid is tax relief. It is tax relief from the government, a benefit to charities that comes in a consequence of a gift aid donation. For higher rate taxpayers, that can also be tax relief for them of the difference between the basic rate and the higher rate. So that's gift aid. So what's the gift aid on small donation scheme? Well, as I said, it's a very misleading title because it's not gift aid at all. But it was a pleasant little surprise back just around about 11 years ago. No one was asking for this scheme, but it appeared out of nowhere. And I guess one of the reflections 11 years on that we can very genuinely say is, was it a blessing or is it a curse? In many ways, there are many benefits to the scheme. There's money to be had from making the most of this scheme, but actually, is it more hassle than it's worth? And that's what we're going to look at a little bit together. Been in place for just over 11 years. It was updated, slightly simplified. Well, depending on your perspective, slightly simplified in some areas and slightly more complicated in other areas back in 2017. But what it is top-up relief at the rate of 25%. On cash, contactless and chip and pin donations of £30 or less. That's why it's called small donations. And I think part of the reason it's called gift aid, well, it's not tax relief. That's important to say. It's not tax relief. But one of the reasons it's called gift aid is because it's administered with the gift aid scheme. So it kind of, some of the administration ties in with it. But also it's the same rate. It's the same rate of 25% that a gift aid donation, that a gift aid would come on a gift aid donation. So cash, contactless, so that's your card or your Apple Pay or whatever. And then actually the chip and pin is brand new. So that's from just the end of last year, the end of 2023. Chip and pin donations were included. And I think the main reason they were included was that, I don't know about you, but when I go somewhere and I make a contactless payment, every now and then my card issuer asks me instead, oh no, sorry, you need to enter your PIN. And so I think that's what it is. It's just simply saying, let's make sure that those security provisions there are around using a card mean that there's not a prevention from using the scheme, because we then need to go and enter our PIN. It's donations of £30 or less. And note, there is no requirement for the donor to be a taxpayer. In fact, you might not even know who the donor is. And so that's the key ingredient that makes it different from gift aid. For each charity, the amount that can be claimed is subject to an overall annual donations limit of £8,000. So if you think of top-up relief of 25% on 8,000, so effectively that's potentially a maximum of £2,000 benefit to the charity. You might argue a small benefit on small donations, depending on how big your charity is. However, fairly complex community buildings rules means that some charities, many charities that operate out of a number of different buildings that are eligible as community buildings could actually end up claiming much more than that 25% of £8,000. And it's great that there's no paperwork from the donor needed. There's no need to maintain contact with someone to make sure that declarations are up to date and you know what their current address is. But having said that, whilst you don't have that paperwork requirement, there are some quite complex rules to the gift aid on small donation scheme, and records need to be kept really diligently to quite an extreme degree, which we'll find in a minute. So let's just have a little bit more of a think about it. Who is eligible? What is eligible, and where are they eligible? So firstly, who? This is applicable to charities that they must have claimed gift aid in that same tax year. They must be doing that. Now, whether they've physically put in that claim or not, they must have had an eligible gift aid donation. They will put a claim in that tax year to be eligible for the gift aid on small donation scheme. They mustn't have received any kind of penalty with regard to their compliance with gift aid or gift aid on small donations for the last 2 years. Otherwise, they can't use the scheme. And then connected charities with a close connection with similar purposes that are connected via various different kind of means. They need to share annual limits. They're effectively treated as one charity, and we'll cover that a little bit more later. But then what is eligible? As I've already said, cash, contactless and chip and pin donations of £30 or less. But also there's the £8,000 limit, but there's also that limit is lowered if you don't claim much by the way of gift aid. So the annual limit is the lower of 10 times the amount of your eligible gift aid donations. That's called the matching rule, or £8,000. So the lower of those two ones. So if you only claim gift aid on a donation of £100 each year, then the maximum you can claim top-up relief under gift aid on small donations is 10 times £100. That's £1,000. So that would be £250 relief. And then, really important, as with gift aid, it must be only on donation. You can't claim gift aid on small donations on small kind of payments to gain entry to an event, or a small membership fee, because there are benefits that are there. That's not a donation. That is a payment in return for a service or access or whatever. And then this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, because there is a choice between either claiming gift aid on small donations under one overall limit of small donations, £8,000, collected anywhere in the UK by the charity, or if the charity operates out of 2 or more community buildings, you can have multiple limits of £8,000 covering the small donations collected in the local authority areas of each qualifying community building. Isn't that complicated? But we'll look at that in a minute. What is a community building? A community building is defined as a building or even a part of a building which the charity uses to run charitable activities of various kinds. They don't need to own the building, but it does need to be a building that's used for that purpose. And charitable activities in this context, they're defined as group activities where at least 10 beneficiaries at a time are taking part in those charitable activities, and that needs to happen at least 6 times in that community building during a tax year. Again, depending on kind of the work that your charity does, that might be quite easy to meet. It might be quite complicated. it does need to be 10 beneficiaries at the same time. So it can't be, here's a bunch of individual counselling sessions taking place in separate parts of the building. It does need to be some kind of group charitable activity. So a typical example, of course, might be a church service, where those taking part in the church service, there's more than 10 of them, and it's happening more than 6 times in a particular year. That building must be open to the public. It can't be a building where there's a charge that someone needs to pay to be able to get into the building to take part in those charitable activities. Those need to be open charitable activities for this to qualify as a community building. And so examples here, as I've mentioned, churches, might be mosques, it might be a scout hut, it might be a village hall, but it's not a charity shop or a care home. It's not somewhere where actually what people are doing for those charitable activities is paying a fee, or there's buying or selling going on there, rather than the activity being a together activity that anyone can access. So that's what a community building is. And if you are a charity that has 2 or more community buildings, and again, I would say church is the most common example we come across where people do this, where churches that perhaps are covered by one charitable registration have more than one venue. They can make the choice between either claiming the £8,000 that you can collect anywhere in the UK, or having a top-up payment on donations of £8,000 collected that relate to each community building. And it's not just donations that you collect in that community building, but it's donations that are collected in and this is where it gets confusing, the same local authority area as where that community building is based. So again, it's worth thinking about your particular circumstances. It might very well be that you have more than one building in a local or authority area. And you can choose which building they're allocated to make the most of this scheme. So those are the kind of core fundamentals of it. I think when it comes to record keeping, this is where things can get a little bit involved, because you need to make sure you keep really, really good records of where the donation was collected. It's a condition of the scheme that the donation is banked in a UK bank account in the name of the charity. So what you can't do is receive a small donation of £20, claim gift aid or small donations on it, not bank it, and use it to buy the milk instead for your charity. And you shouldn't really be doing things like that anyway. That's not good practice. But you can't do that. That wouldn't be eligible. You need to make sure that donation is banked without deduction in a UK bank. You need to record the denominations of all notes, bank notes that you receive if you're claiming cash notes, to prove that donations were less than £30 or less. And then, of course, if you have a contactless terminal or chip and pin machine, you need to be keeping records of those payments that are coming in and where they were collected from, what the location of that terminal was, perhaps some kind of reference number that's involved there. And if you make the most of the community buildings provisions, the address of the community building, and document how it is that it qualifies as a community building, why does it qualify, why does it meet the rules, the dates and locations of where money was collected, whether it was in the community building or somewhere else in the local authority area. And then, of course, which building the donations were allocated to. So the record keeping is fairly significant. And actually, there are real challenges, I guess, over this, where, how on earth do you prove that a donation was £30 or less? How is it that, if I go to a charity and I give them five rolled up £20 notes, is that a donation of £100, or is it a donation of £20 5 times? Well, of course, it's actually a donation of £100. So it's not eligible for gift aid on small donations. But what processes do you have in place to make sure that you are correctly claiming gift aid on small donations or not? And this is where briefing people who count and bank and etc. is really, really important. So it's quite an involved scheme, which leads us to the question of, my goodness me, is it really worth all the effort? Is it really worth all the effort for £2,000 or maybe more? And I think probably that's a question that only you can answer in your context. I think one of the reason why I said, is it a blessing or is it a curse, is that I don't think it's right for trustees to ignore a chance to maximise the benefit to a charity through claiming all the reliefs that they're eligible to claim. And yet you could argue for some charities, the administration effort and complexity and the cost of doing it might possibly outweigh the benefit. My only comment would be get organised. And if you get organised, it will kind of pretty much run itself. And it's free money. It's free money that you can deploy towards the charitable purposes, which we've already talked about as being so important and fundamental to why a charity exists. So I'll perhaps leave that up to you to assess in your context. And I'd be interested to hear, perhaps in the chat or with questions later on, people's experiences of using the Gift Aid on Small Donation Scheme. How have you found it? Have you found it complicated, or have you found it quite easy to run and to use? But we're always available to help advise you and just to kind of have a little look over your processes or documentation and to help you understand whether you are doing things in the right way, whether that's actually in the full-blown Gift Aid scheme or whether that is in the confusingly and misleadingly named Gift Aid on Small Donation Scheme. Josh.
Thanks, Ed. I'm just going to take this opportunity of sort of how we can help, just to give a little bit of information about our outsourced financial service to you, just so that you can have a think about that and whether it's applicable to you as a charity. We find that there are a couple of bookkeeping scenarios that where we can particularly benefit charity clients, and those are where the board are not receiving the information that they feel that they need to make good decisions, where systems and controls need to be improved, which would improve the financial data, or where there is a transition, say a key finance person is moving on, then we can sort of work with you to develop a service with you. We have the pleasure of working alongside charity clients, and what we do with those is that we help prepare their books and records, including allocating transactions to various funds, and investment bookkeeping and tracking as well. We take advantage of cloud-based accounting software and receipt grabbing applications for a swift process and a good digital trail. We establish processes and controls to protect the charity's funds. If you were to work with us, we would allocate a member of our team to look after the charity to build up familiarity and relationship. But other members of our team are on hand to cover sort of holiday and share their expertise. We would also prepare or could also prepare monthly management accounts for the board against budget and fund. And we would be happy to answer any board questions as they arise. So the question sort of for you to think about is, is that a service that could benefit your charity? Is now a good time to think about it? And if you do like the sound of some of what I've said, then do get in touch with Ed or I, and we can take it forward with you and our head of bookkeeping, a lady called Arabella. And on to the news segment, I believe. So I'm going to invite, I think, Cecile to just kick off the latest news on the Charity Governance Code review.
Thank you, Josh. So the Charity Governance Code, just to remind you, is the voluntary code of good governance for charities in England and Wales. It is not a legal requirement to follow it, but there is significant encouragement, nay, pressure to do so, including the strong recommendation of the Charity Commission. Now, the contents of the code are the responsibility of an independent steering group of people from organisations with particular commitment to good charity sector governance. And that group has a practice of reviewing the code approximately every 3 years. And the latest review is underway now in the form of a public consultation through an online questionnaire. Don't you just love them? What the review is wanting to do is gather views from chairs, trustees, staff, and other people committed to the charity sector. So that would include, for example, professional advisors such as Burton. And it's trying to find out for the first time why some charities don't use the code. It's actively asking why not. So there's a particular section this time for non-user charities to ask questions around barriers and obstacles that prevent them using the code. For those of us that do use the code, and I know that does include a number of you that are here today, The consultation questions look at the content, and that includes whether there are areas that should be added or expanded, for example, staff pay, political engagement, lobbying, campaigning, climate change, environmental issues. And then looking at the structure and the accessibility, including whether the current approach of greater detail and more recommendations for larger charities, that's charities subject to compulsory audit, so income over £1 million, and less detail and less recommendations of good practice for smaller charities, is that the right structure, is part of the area they're exploring. There are 2 questions on what issues there are for charities and whether they engage with what are described as, quotes, current issues and changing trends in society and, quotes, contentious debates, close quotes. So possibly, for example, public discussion of contested heritage stories and contested heritage material items like buildings and artefacts. That might be something on which some respondents may comment. For some of us, I think, perhaps the most worrying suggestion that can be detected in these questions is that in future there could be a fee charge for using the code. The justification offered is that money has to be found to support the future development of the code and to enhance it by providing, quotes, an engaging website and tools. You could question whether that is a necessity, and that is for you to form a view on. I suspect people may have a particular view on the merits of the suggestion should have to pay for using a voluntary code of good governance. However, that is where we are. To have you say and answer any of the questions in this questionnaire, you've got a little bit of time. It closes on the 11th of August, and we'll put a link in the post-event mailing for that questionnaire if you're minded to have your say. Ed, Stewardship Generosity Report.
Thank you. We're very mindful that quite a number of our clients and contacts are Christian charities and churches, particularly. And I just wanted to highlight this brilliant report from our friends at Stewardship, really that they commissioned to think a little bit about generosity, exploring Christian giving in the UK. And so if this is relevant to you, I just encourage you to take a look at it. We'll put a link in the, I was going to say link in the show notes, but we're not that kind of event. It's a link in the post-event mailing. And this was a survey that was undertaken in November 2023, more than 4,000 Christian adults in the UK. And one thing, for example, it found is that amongst those surveyed, that 2.5% of their post-tax income was given to churches or Christian causes. If you expand that to all charitable causes, that would be 3.2% of all causes, which is just ahead of the kind of UK population at large. So again, interesting findings in there, but also some really, really helpful observations for leaders and for trustees of Christian charities. And in particular, kind of asking a bit about what is it that prevents people from giving more towards Christian causes and churches. And the 2 main reasons given were simply, I can't afford to give more. And then secondly, I'm not sure how well it will be used. I'm not sure how well it will be used. Now, interestingly, that is a statement that's paralleled in wider research on giving in the UK. But I think it's a real challenge to those of us that are involved in leadership and trusteeship. How well are we both telling the story about the way in which funds are used? How much do we actually make it very clear the connection between people's giving and the pursuit of the purposes that we have and the impact that giving makes? It's very, very challenging findings. There's much, much more than that in this report, and I'd really encourage you to dig into it if that would be of interest to you. I'm very conscious that we've hit 1 o'clock. We're going to be just a few more minutes. Cecile will be sharing about Charity Commission current areas of focus and concern. Then we're going to hit stop on the recording and answer some questions. If you do need to leave us now, that's absolutely fine. Do catch up with the recording on this last bit at the end. Otherwise, do stick with us just for a few more minutes. And Cecile, why don't you just take us through some of the latest areas of focus and concern for the Charity Commission?
So knowing about these is important because it will help you identify where your charity might need to be taking some actions, and again, come and talk to us about how you can improve things and reduce risks. Areas I've picked out from the Charity Commission's current work programme: poor management of relationships and legal arrangements with suppliers and failing to review suppliers, inadequate procedures and poor board decisions about both acquiring land and disposing of land and buildings, failures to identify and manage conflicts of interest. That is sadly a consistent theme in the Commission's work. And then the fourth area that I particularly noted was inadequate record keeping. In some cases, it's been finding charities unable to demonstrate whether their trustees knew about something of importance to that charity, never mind whether they actually took any appropriate decisions and actions on important issues. Particularly, there's been concerns around areas where the charity, in the circumstances, needed protection, and there is not evidence that the trustees were either aware of that or actioned it. So there's some really important lessons to learn there. Let's pass you back to Josh, who's going to chair the question session.